Hello once again and welcome to the Gaming News Canada show. As always, I'm your host, Steve McAllister. We are less than 1 month away from the Canadian Gaming Summit, when the movers and shakers of the industry will gather at the Metro Toronto Convention Centre for 3 days of booth visits, panels, receptions, networkings, and sundry other matters related to gambling. One of those people, or one of those movers and shakers, is Troy Ross, the president of TRM Public Affairs. And Troy, welcome back to the podcast. We want to get back really just to catch up. It's been a while since we've spoken, and I kind of just thought the timing was right to do a kind of State of the Union episode of the podcast before we see each other in Toronto next month.
Always a pleasure, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Hey, Troy, let's start. The reason I reached out to you last week, we saw a story in Global Gaming News, and you were quoted in it that there have been some discussions with advocates for regulated gaming in British Columbia, with policymakers there, and with people like yourself who have experience in the industry. And I think Geoff Zochodne wrote about the same issue a couple of weeks ago on covers.com. I think maybe that got some hearts fluttering about whether or not British Columbia was going to be next. Maybe you can just, set the record straight, or just give our audience kind of the pulse of what's going on right now with regards to BC following Alberta and Ontario's lead eventually.
Sure, happy to. I think, the engagement in British Columbia is really no different than the approach that we took several years ago in the province of Ontario, or the approach over the last couple of years in the province of Alberta. And we have been very transparent about our objectives. We're going to go and engage and meet with elected officials, policymakers, and regulators in every province across Canada to educate them about the benefits of a proper regulatory regime for online gaming. And explain to them that regulation channels the vast majority of play, which is already taking place in their province, into a licensing system. Really trying to engage them and talk to them about the fact that the models like the one in Ontario and the one in development in Alberta are frankly superior to the Lottery Corporation site alone, for a number of reasons. One, they capture almost 100% of the market share compared to 20, 22, 25% market share. And even among that, I think the vast majority of those lottery sales are lottery tickets, not iCasino or sports betting. All that to say, we want to engage them, we want to educate them and talk to them about the fact that Canadian jurisdictions are out of line and well out of step with the rest of Western society who have chosen to regulate the market.
You and I discussed British Columbia a lot in the past, but just because we continue to get subscribers and we more people in this podcast, maybe just take you back a little bit. It seems to me again that British Columbia is a province that would be ripe for an open market a la Ontario because there's such, one, there's obviously some popular base there, but there's also a vibrant gaming industry that's been there for a while. You have companies like GeoComply, and which acquired One Comply, another BC business, a few years ago. You have suppliers out there. You have producers of games. There's a pretty vibrant gaming industry already in existence out in BC. And I think for maybe some people in the industry away from North America, they perhaps wonder why BC hasn't been on board before now.
Yeah, from my perspective, it's puzzling, Steve. The reality is, I think I know many of the provinces are going to do this in their own due time, but the reality is we're just starting with our engagement in British Columbia. Alberta's moving down a path. I think there will be a number of other provinces taking some interest in kicking tires and looking at what a regulatory regime might look like. But the public policy discussion in British Columbia has, up until very recently, really been controlled by the BC Lottery. And I'm not aware of very many lottery corporations or monopolies that happily volunteer to give up what they view as their monopoly on a market.
Yeah, and I think we've seen that story in Quebec, Troy, that goes on and on. That the Quebec Online Gaming Coalition's been pretty public and has been pretty strong in its messaging, calling for an open market in Belle Province. A lot of Quebec appears to continue to dig in its heels, and we haven't really heard anything from the Quebec government on that. But that it seems everybody's dug in their heels on that issue.
Sadly, I think you're right, Steve. I think those discussions are inevitable, but they're taking quite a while because there are incumbent operators who are dead set against exploring regulation, which is disappointing, but we are where we are.
Hey, Troy, just along those lines, just everything going on right now with Donald Trump and tariffs and what's happened in Canada with Mark Carney's election as prime minister and more cooperation being encouraged among the provinces and knocking down interprovincial trade barriers. And again, just a conversation about there are a lot of problems in this country that needs to be fixed right now. It just seems to me that would open the door more than a crack to bring in a regulated gambling regime. And we look at Ontario, and as Dave Briggs reported in Gaming News Canada in the newsletter last week, I mean, the province has taken in, or there's been almost $1.5 billion in tax revenue generated from the market now since April 2022.
There's no debating the success of the Ontario model. And it's almost, you and I talked about this, I think last week, Steve, Ontario keeps setting records and then quarter by quarter keeps breaking those records. Some almost become old hat that iGo breaks another record every time they do a monthly or quarterly report. It's a bit puzzling to me why ministers of finance wouldn't be clamoring to introduce some kind of a regulatory regime like this, because the data points are there. The evidence is there from the province of Ontario. It's earning significant revenue, and it's adding all kinds of good public policy benefits like consumer protection, responsible gaming features. There really isn't a good reason to dismiss online regulation.
And I think we'll probably also see later this year in the fall, Troy, that again, that 50 operators in Ontario and really hasn't impacted the Ontario Lottery and Gaming Corporation. In fact, OLG and I think the 2 annual reports since the open market launch have had increases in digital online revenue. We've kind of, I guess, beaten the proverbial horse to death with the OLG, acknowledging at conferences and in conversations that we have that the competition has actually been good for OLG's digital business and kind of forced them to be more innovative and creative. And I expect when OLG's new annual report comes out, probably September, October, that it's going to paint the story again, that it's kind of the rising tide raises all ships.
The idea that this somehow cannibalizes the lottery corporation spend is nonsense. There's no evidence of that in Ontario. In fact, it's been quite the opposite. I don't remember what the figures are. The first year, Ontario Lottery was up 31 or 33% revenue, 22% on customer signups. The following year was double-digit increases as well. I don't remember what the exact number is, but I'd be surprised if that trend didn't continue and the numbers continue to escalate for OLG. What's interesting is all of the evidence coming out of Ontario is that even with all of these operators, OLG numbers continue to go up on their Play OLG site. The numbers for iGaming Ontario are plain as day. They're there on the iGo site. Those numbers continue to go up every report. And while I don't know if it is a public document, for at least a period of time, iGaming Ontario and the regulator, Alcohol and Gaming Commission, kept a running tally of operators that had departed the Ontario market. And there were quite a few operators, frankly, that had voluntarily said, oh, you're regulating the marketplace and we have to be gone by a certain date. They voluntarily left the market, which only helps drive play to regulated sites. So there really isn't any good public policy reason or financial reason not to look at something similar to what Ontario has done.
Yeah, and I think, Troy, and let's not be naive. I'm sure there are some operators who have had their struggles in Ontario, but I talked to a lot of operators out there, and they paint a pretty rosy picture. I mean, I use Betty as an example, where Justin Park's been pretty open, and Betty with the numbers that they've seen with the market here. You talk to the bigger brands, and they're happy with their business here. And I know I think it's about 85% now of the market are playing on regulated websites. Of course, you'd like to see that number higher. But even at that number, you seem, and the fact, I think, that we still have 50 operators. And Troy, you remember when this market opened in 2022, and we were back, I think, on Twitter Spaces back then, when we had people like you and Amanda Brewer and Phil Gray and others on the podcast, and there was kind of talk about consolidation from day one. And here we sit 40 months later, and we really haven't seen consolidation.
And I think it's like every other marketplace. There will be some who, for a variety of reasons, decide to depart the market. And while I can't go into detail, I know there are a number of online gaming operators that are planning to enter the Ontario marketplace over the coming few months. So there will probably be some coming in, some going out, but I expect that number to remain relatively constant.
Hey, Troy, you mentioned that again, it is early days with speaking with policymakers in BC, but I have to believe that someone within the BC government and legislatures out there are following what's going on in Ontario, and are kind of keeping tabs on what's going on in Alberta as well.
There's no doubt that there are government officials across the country tracking what is going on in the province of Ontario. Whether or not the province next door, Alberta, launches, whether that has any added pressure for British Columbia, I tend to think probably not. There certainly is some interest, and they're happy to have the conversation. But as I say, it's very early on in our engagement with decision makers in British Columbia, and I think they're open to have the conversation, but I wouldn't want to create the expectation that something is going to happen there quickly.
Hey, Troy, what can you tell us about Alberta? And again, I'm not going to ask you for a timeline, because that's an unfair question. You might jump off the line and stop the interview. But I guess we know that the iGaming Alberta Act's gone through three readings through the legislature out there now. The wheels are in motion. Like, what can you tell us that's going on behind the scenes right now with getting to a place where this market will launch?
That's an important first milestone for the government of Alberta to pass that legislation. I suspect the folks in Alberta will be working on creating, staffing, and appointing appropriate people to the Alberta iGaming Corporation over the coming months. And I suspect that the regulator will be doing its due diligence to get ready for the launch of a regulatory regime. But in terms of a lot of details about what are the next milestones, we're all waiting with bated breath to hear what's next.
And I think we'll just point out too, there wasn't a lot of noise in the lead up to Ontario launching as well, right? I mean, that was a lot of the old story about the ducks swimming on the water, that the head's not bobbing up top and the legs are paddling furiously below the surface. So I'm sure that's what's happening out there right now.
Yeah, there were a lot. Listen, I think there are some. I'll always say, I think the regulatory model in Ontario is a solid B plus, and you and I have spent enough time in and around me working in or with government, and you reporting on it, that if you get a B plus, that's you cash your chips and get out of the casino. But I think there were some lessons learned coming out of the Ontario experience that Alberta would like to implement before launch. Things like a centralized self-exclusion program, maybe some more automation for some of the manual reporting processes that are still in place in Ontario, those types of things. So they're moving down a path. I think they're trying to figure out how to automate many of those functions, and the industry's ready to work with the government of Alberta as they do that.
Yeah, and the other thing you won't have to deal with, Troy, in Alberta as well, is there won't be that backlash. There won't be that avalanche of advertising that we saw in the early days of Ontario, because you're most likely going to have fewer operators. DAGCO did address some of the advertising involving athletes. And so again, I think for Alberta, there's some lessons learned there, and it does give Minister Nally and the province an advantage opening up this market, just to have those lessons learned.
Going first is always a little tougher than being number 2 or number 3. Yeah.
Hey, before we let you go, I do want to talk to you about what's gone on in Ontario. We talked about the April numbers, which are really good, released by iGaming Ontario, but we also saw the Ontario government, now just back in session, finally made it official, the separation of the AGCO from iGaming Ontario. Stan Cho is now going to be the minister of the newly created Tourism, Culture, and Gaming Ministry. And again, Stan Cho's appointment is fairly significant, because a lot of people who listen to this podcast, Troy, don't realize that Stan's someone he's not a minnow or a novice when it comes to the gaming portfolio.
Far from it, Steve. Stan has been a champion for the iGaming industry for years now. And what people may not realize is, before we launched the iGaming regime, way back in 2019, 2020, when the government of Ontario was conducting their consultations with the industry, Stan at the time was the parliamentary assistant to the Minister of Finance. And that made him the political lead on all of the iGaming consultations. And Stan and his staff were really impressive. They were generous with their time. They learned quickly, and really became advocates and champions for the creation of this regime. Stan was then promoted to Minister of Transport and a number of other responsibilities. But really, having a guy like Minister Cho and his colleague Doug Downey, the Attorney General, those two individuals deserve a great deal of the credit for how successful the Ontario online gaming regime has been. And both have been a real pleasure to work with. And truthfully, I think iGaming Ontario will be in very good hands with Stan Cho. And I think he will continue to be a real advocate and champion for the industry.
Hey, Troy, just because you've worked in both government and at the AGCO, like what role do Doug and Stan, their offices play, or how involved will they be in the gaming file?
I, it often depends on the minister, the time frame, when things are getting done. But in both, at least my experience with both Doug Downey and with Stan Cho, is that these are ministers that are very involved in their files. Um, Doug Downey has invested a lot of time and effort into making sure that the online gaming or regulatory regime was robust. He's been an advocate and championed that reference question. And Stan Cho has long been an advocate for ensuring that iGaming Ontario was a commercially sensible, commercially reasonable business partner for the online gaming operators. Um, I think they're both going to continue to play those types of roles, Steve. And I'll just speak for myself. I think myself and my clients, I think they're thrilled that those are the two ministers we continue to deal with.
Yeah, it's a great point about IGO, Troy. And I think, again, it's easy to forget that IGO is still a very new organization and obviously in a state of flux right now as we wait for the board of directors there to announce Martha Otten's replacement. But there's certainly a lot of work to do there. So I would think the fact that Stan's very familiar with the file, has had his fingers in a proverbial pie, that's going to be an advantage for the operators and the entire industry moving forward.
Yeah, it's not often that, and this is speaking across the country, it's not often that ministers that are responsible for gambling um, play the kind of champions role for the industry that Stan Cho and Doug Downey have. In fact, it's quite rare. Too often, in my opinion, politicians want the money, but don't want to pay a whole lot of attention to the gambling industry. They just they're happy with the revenues, but they don't want to talk about gambling.
Hey, Troy, last question. I did want to, just because the Canadian Gaming Summit is around the corner, just for our audience, some of who haven't been to the summit before, don't get to these conferences, and to think, both of us see the value of this summit getting together, the Canadian industry, and I think probably even more so right now, just personally speaking, with what's going on in the U.S. and we have seen a decrease in travel across the border. So I think it probably has never been more important to have an industry function in Toronto for Canadian operators and suppliers, and as I've always said, I think for mainstream media who don't have the chance to cover this industry on a daily basis, the summit really is a good opportunity to come and listen to some of these panels and meet a few people and learn a bit more about the industry, as I have for, I think this will be my third or fourth summit now.
I'm sorry, Steve. Was there? What was the question?
I think, yeah, sorry, that was my soliloquy. I should have let off with that. Just really the value of the summit, Troy, for people, and again, you're in the weeds on a day-to-day basis, but it is a different dynamic when you get 3,500 people together at the Metro Toronto Convention Center for a couple of days, and the networking and the conversations and listening to those panels that's good for anybody who's fairly new to the industry.
I think the show's an absolute. If you're involved in the gambling industry in Canada, the show is an absolute must attend. Uh, Anyone in the sector who is on the supplier side, the operator side, affiliates, payment providers, suppliers to land-based, charitable sector, or online, are generally have representation there, and vast majority of the regulators from variety of provinces and lottery corporations are all in attendance. If you're not and you haven't attended the Canadian Gaming Summit before, you're missing out.
And because we, in the Wednesday newsletter, we post a lot of jobs. I think that's the other thing, Troy, too, that if you're someone who maybe hasn't looked at working in the gaming industry before, as we talked about in this forum an awful lot of times, there are a lot of opportunities to work in this business. Again, whether it's on the tech side and on the finance side, on the marketing side, on the regulatory side, this industry has a lot of smart people, and there are a lot of really cool opportunities to work in it.
The number of times I've heard stories about deals getting done, or at least begun or finalized and consummated at the show, I couldn't count.
Yep, agreed. That's Troy Ross, President of TRM Public Affairs. Hey, Troy, it's always a pleasure getting on the podcast, and it'll be great to catch up in person at the Canadian Gaming Summit in a couple of weeks.
I look forward to it, and here's hoping we're toasting the Stanley Cup champion Oilers.
That would be you, and a lot of Canadian hockey fans would say amen to that, Troy.
Thanks, Steve.
That's it for this episode of the Gaming News Canada show. As always, you can find us at gamingnewscanada.ca and also on the various podcast platforms and on the Gaming News Canada YouTube channel. Thanks again to Troy Ross for joining us today, and we will see everybody again very soon.